Hello, and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation with a change maker working to accelerate the transition to a sustainable, carbon neutral society. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Of course, we all know that CO2 emissions tracking and reduction is the biggest challenge facing the 21st century economy. First, reducing and then reversing the rising levels of anthropogenic CO2 in the atmosphere is not a project that one company is going to be able to take care of alone. But it is a collaboration that will transform economies, making them more efficient and profitable in the long run. After companies, regulatory agencies, and citizens find a shared language for talking about the problem. Our guests today are Adam Kramer, CEO of nZero, a carbon tracking and reporting company that's been on the show before, and Scott Martin, Vice President and Head of Global Commercial Business at 3Degrees, a firm that specializes in carbon strategy consulting, decarbonization program development, carbon sequestration, and renewable energy credit advisory services. They recently partnered to offer a comprehensive carbon reporting and management solution. Their current clients include Microsoft, Etsy, and Expedia, among others. You can learn more about nZero at www.nzero.com and about 3Degrees at www.3degreesinc.com. 3 is the numeral 3, degrees is spelled out, and there's no space between any of 3 degrees or Inc. 3degreesinc.com. Welcome to the show, Adam and Scott. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks for having us.
Fantastic, Mitch. Thank you. Thanks for having us.
And just so all of you can orient to the voices, Adam spoke first, Scott spoke second. So that was Adam and Scott. Now, I wanted to start off by asking, why join forces to provide this end-to-end solution? Measuring and managing carbon emissions is a very complicated undertaking. We're trying to solve a lot of problems right now. Is it impossible for one company to do these things alone?
I think the simple answer is yes. The idea of decarbonization and hitting a net zero goal, which is what so many companies talk about. And for the record, for the viewers or listeners, this is Adam again. To be able to do that, it is incredibly complex, and it starts with the data. Everything in an organization and an enterprise has an environmental impact, and we got to capture all of this data. So carbon accounting, the basic for this, is essentially a data aggregation problem. And so with the nZero platform, we're able to collect that data, to automate that, to bring that into our system, and then help the beginning of the journey in carbon management. So how do you begin to take this data and through our system and our automated intelligence and other tools to begin to understand areas to begin to decarbonize, to reduce your impact? But that's the beginning, and that's an important part of the journey, but it takes partners like 3Degrees who have been doing this for, and I'm not going to speak, but for almost 20 years, I believe, that are real leaders on doing this. And I'll hand it to Scott to kind of continue that.
Yeah, Scott, can you tell us what 3Degrees' contribution to the solution is?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Mitch. Thanks, Adam. So 3Degrees is primarily a climate products and services oriented company, right? So we help our customers on their climate journey, which starts, as Adam rightly pointed to, with data collection and understanding exactly what their emissions footprint looks like. And we help clients then work to, we advise and implement them on greenhouse gas reduction strategies across all 3 scopes of emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3. We have different services that are tailored to the specific needs and goals of our clients. We have products that address different regions and different scopes. There's long-term renewable energy plans and procurement. There's carbon credit portfolio management, transportation decarbonization, goal setting, stakeholder education, lots of different things that clients work with us on. But by and large, it is all in the service of their reductions of their emissions.
Now, because you're two different companies, listeners may be thinking, okay, so I'm going to have 2 different tools, but have you put together a unified view of this information so that you've simplified it for the customers?
So nZero is a software platform. And so we provide views for our customers today to be able to see where their emissions are coming from, to understand it, to collect the insights. And then they're able to work with a partner like 3Degrees, and in this case, well, you're bringing customers to 3Degrees today to actually help them implement that strategy on saying, all right, we understand where this is coming from. What are things we can do in the marketplace, or working on some of their solutions, like being able to help with green energy tariffs or understanding different tools to actually accelerate that journey. So two different service offerings, if you will. One is coming from a software deployment, the other is coming from that human interaction. And there is some overlap between these two things, but it's very complementary to each other, to a place where that handoff exists.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Adam, the goal with any client is to ensure that they have really clean and accurate data that is supporting their decision-making framework going forward, right? And their future mitigation strategies that we might work on with them. And so having that data captured in spreadsheets and gathered across continents and business units and operations teams can be cumbersome and fraught with error. And so the nZero platform actually makes it easier to store that data and ensures a single system of record from which 3Degrees can then work with those clients on those mitigation strategies over the long term. And this could include, strategic work on net zero goals that, can be 2030, 2040, 2050, right? And other suitable climate targets. But having that information in a concise manner and location really does help.
Well, and of course, it simplifies ESG reporting, which is going to be a more important and more pressing issue for a lot of folks. But let's talk a little about the idea of net zero. What is your guidance to your customers about how to communicate about their net zero goals? You help them set them, but what do you recommend they say to their customers or their suppliers, and the expectations they're setting for their suppliers as they begin to implement that internally?
Well, that is a big question, Mitch. So, net zero goals are a newer thing, and there's a lot of people making those commitments, right? And some of those are, all the way endorsed at the board level or C-suite level, and have organization-wide commitment. Others are less so. But the journey to net zero is a strategic kind of repositioning of a company's overall success metrics and how they view their business going forward. Carbon reduction really needs to become a part of all business strategies, including supply chain work, and measured progress has to be constant. So, this is everything from operational improvements that reduce, fuel usage, or do fuel switching, right, to electrification of assets, including commercial fleets, and then optimization of supply chains to reduce carbon intensity. All of that being said, net zero is a long journey. And it is a lot of work for organizations, and it really is a full change in much of their operations. And so,
and it's not even really the end goal. It's net zero is when we stop making it worse. Are you also talking with them about carbon positive operations, even though that's 15 years out potentially?
Yeah, great point. So I think a lot of organizations just are not there yet, right?
Yeah.
To talk about carbon positive. Yes, there are a few. There are the large leaders in the space, the tip of the spear, so to speak. But most organizations that we are dealing with are either in their journey somewhere and working really hard to just do better, or they're just starting their journey. And I think that's where a partnership with nZero makes a lot of sense, right? Is because, again, understanding that data, gathering that data, using that data to make decisions, regardless of whether you're in the beginning of that journey or the middle of that journey, really is key to making the types of decisions that are going to have the most impact toward your chosen goals and strategies.
And Adam, since you're the front end of this and where a lot of the reporting takes place, what is nZero's guidance to a customer in terms of, not just saying we've got an ESG goal, but talking about the difficulty of getting there? Because a lot of the times you start this and you realize it's harder, and that is something we can share and share learnings about and potentially make it an even greater contribution, even though the emissions haven't fallen as much as you thought they might.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, first off, I'd like to separate the ESG conversation from net zero commitments and emission reduction goals, only because I think they get conflated a bit. And so the organizations we're working with that are setting these targets for emissions reductions or to hit net zero, and they're all at different phases of their journey. The first thing it starts with is actually understanding the data. Over the last few years, there was a number of companies who came out, and I commend everybody who has made commitments to reduce environmental impact, because that is truly the first step, right? Is a public commitment to do so. But they would make a commitment like, we want to be net zero, without understanding net of what, right? And so for nZero, when we're engaging with a customer, we said, hey, listen, we want to understand what your goals are. And a number of our customers don't have publicly stated goals today, and they're getting onto the platform so they can understand where, when, and how they're creating environmental impact, then set goals based off that data to reduce it. We also have other customers who are further along on the journey, have set these commitments and made these goals, but want to make sure that, one, they're on target for them, and two, if they need to do a restatement of that or to clarify as better data has become available, that they're able to do so. An example of that, and one of the differentiating features of the nZero platform, is looking at electricity usage. Electricity is used by every business I know, and it creates an environmental impact. And the way that businesses have previously been looking at this is they take a data set from the federal government in the US or from the European Commission in the EU that is generally 18 to 24 months old. And it says, hey, here's the average of your emissions, and we multiply it by your total usage. Here's what's going on. What nZero is saying is, let's look at the actual carbon intensity of the electric grid. For every hour you're consuming electricity, what is the carbon intensity of that grid? And understanding that not only helps you understand what your total impact is, but allows you to make decisions beyond just capital investment into another solar project, which is great, or a capital investment into vehicle fleet electrification, which is great. And all of those are part of the solution. But part of the solution also can be operational in deciding, when do you want to shift certain practices? What are operational pieces you can put in there to not only reduce impact, because there's certain things you have to do as a business regardless, but if I can do them at different hours of the day when the sun is shining brighter in the West Coast, which means the grid intensity is lower, I can actually reduce my carbon impact just by shifting the time of day I'm doing something. So it's about information and data, and then being able to have a partner of like 3Degrees who can say, here's other things we can do and how we can help push this forward. And here's, here's access to market solutions. Here's access to utility solutions, and putting this all together. It really, when they say it takes a village, it's actually going to take the entire planet for us to be able to help every enterprise and organization hit their targeted and stated goal.
So, I have never heard anybody describe characterizing the grid the way you just did. The idea that you could say that at any given hour, this is the carbon impact of using the grid under those circumstances. That's a much more granular way to count this. So kudos. Are you considering making that information something that could be tapped by anybody who might be interested in building an application on top of that data set?
Yeah. Today, our focus is on supporting customers natively through our platform, or supporting customers of our partners. But absolutely, right? The idea is we want to get this data to a level of refinement and access that we can make it available to more and more users. And we are working with some utilities today here in the US, and we're looking at some additional ones to bring on board so that they can make this data available through your platform that you look at your power bill in, and you can look at your houses or businesses' energy usage to understand that. So we're definitely heading down that pathway to making that much more accessible. Because listen, we are running a business. We do
Sure.
want to make money, but we also want to help the planet, as our name, nZero, net zero, hit net zero goals as fast as possible. And then, as you alluded to earlier, accelerate towards carbon positive.
Now, once you've started to count, and I think the advice to not declare goals until you've started to count is very well taken. Scott, what is 3Degrees' basic thesis about how to build a path to CO2 to carbon neutrality? Excuse me. What do you recommend in terms of the right mix of projects, or is it completely based on the situation of the client?
Yeah, it starts with understanding what your company can do, what's within the tolerance of their business operations, risk, and budgets, right? And so organizations will start with understanding, I spoke to operational and organizational commitment earlier. That really is where it starts, right? And so if you're going to move toward a net zero target, or you mentioned carbon positive earlier, right? Or carbon neutrality, you really do need to get the organization behind it so you can drive the operational improvements first, the budgeting, the incentives, and the long-term commitments needed to make the required changes. The journey to net zero is really a strategic repositioning. And so carbon reduction needs to become a part of how you measure business success and how you incentivize your team. Over time, determining as an organization the cost associated with not reducing is also important. So what does it mean to look at your company in an environment where potentially your value streams are threatened by climate change, right? And what are some of the implications of that from an investor perspective if you're a publicly traded company? And these are all things that are really important to consider as you prepare yourself to go down that journey. And honestly, there's different ways to model the journey forward and the pathways forward. And again, every company needs to look at the cost and the operational risk and all the other things associated with their individual business to determine the right path forward.
Now, the other thing that a lot of companies get hooked on very early is the idea that if they avoid emissions, they're going to create carbon credits that they can monetize. But carbon credits are still just getting started. So what do both of you suggest are the best practices for thinking about using carbon credits as an organization? Is it something you should sell, or should you be thinking about banking them for other uses?
Well, there are different standards bodies that verify carbon offsets and have protocols for that. And so you can't just change out a light bulb and gain a carbon credit, so to speak, right? You have to be verified, and there's a whole process to go through there, right?
Exactly.
So, I mean, for us, we recommend developing a science-based plan to reduce your emissions across your scopes. Prioritize and measure your reductions as quickly as possible. Get your data in order. Match your remaining emissions for things that you haven't been able to reduce through project-related work. Match those through the support of high-quality, third-party verified emissions reductions projects and mechanisms to neutralize those emissions. And those are again, those are different standards bodies, but those are all widely available. And then revisit and refine your greenhouse gas inventory and emissions boundaries consistently over time to make sure you are capturing all of your emissions, and have a long-term strategic plan, right? Procure through, again, the carbon standards bodies, projects that are within those verification processes, and where possible, conduct project level due diligence. And so that's some of the things that we do for customers as well. We do that due diligence work for them so they don't have to. Carbon markets can be extremely not transparent, especially once you get outside those third-party verified project types and get outside of those standards bodies. And so finally, choose projects that map to the core values of your business, support social and environmental co-benefits that align with other corporate ESG initiatives that you may have in place at your organization. And then I think that will create a good use of money when it comes to carbon credits and keep you out of the headlines, if you will.
We're going to continue talking about the partnership between nZero and 3Degrees in just a moment. We'll be right back. We're back to continue the conversation with Adam Kramer, CEO of nZero, and Scott Martin, Vice President and Head of Global Commercial Business at 3Degrees. Now, one of the things that a lot of folks write us about is what are the jobs that are going to emerge out of using tools like you guys provide? Tell us about who uses this tool set. We hear about the Chief Sustainability Officer, but what are the other roles that companies should be thinking about filling in, hiring people to fill?
Yeah, Mitch, what I think is so exciting right now in the space is that a decade ago, 5 years ago, the idea of a company going on a sustainability journey was the responsibility of the chief sustainability officer if a company had one, or it was the responsibility of whoever was left sitting at the table and was assigned the role. Today, what we're seeing is that the idea of sustainability, and this gets to the point of the conversation, is that sustainability is the responsibility of everybody in the organization. And it starts with them being empowered and having the data to be able to understand how the decisions they make in their jobs affect this. And it's everything from fleet managers to operators to sustainability officers to finance functionality to the board of directors. Everybody has a role in this. And so when we think about the jobs of the future, there is a growing set of functionality in everything from education and teaching people how to use this data and how to engage and create employee engagement to financing functionality, which has existed a lot into the private equity markets and to some of these different spaces, into financing green projects. You're seeing tax specialists who are emerging that specialize in the green financing and green equity space, even following the recent passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which opened up a lot of tax credits that individual businesses can tap into for decarbonization efforts in a way that they haven't been able to before, all the way to how you tap into the strategy. So it's as much about new jobs emerging as the jobs that we think of that are more traditional in industry, adding in this responsibility and this support role for sustainability.
That raises an interesting question about how the tools can help bring people who may not be sustainably minded into the decision process in a constructive way to help them lower the organization's CO2 emissions. Are you also thinking about ways of building educational capabilities into the platform?
Absolutely. That is something that we view in our product roadmap. And more importantly, today we're already working with our primary points of contact at an organization, whether that be out of the CFO's office or the chief sustainability officer, on how to take this data and talk about it with team members to create that engagement.
Now, Scott, earlier in the conversation, you said, let's separate carbon credits from ESG reporting or carbon tracking from ESG reporting. And it was the right thing to say, but there is a lot of debate about ESG right now. So I want to ask what your feeling is about that debate. Are we seeing pushback on the new reporting requirements and adoption of ESG criteria in investing because the movement's succeeding or because it's failing?
Actually, Adam said that, but I will comment on it and then let Adam say it too, or comment on it as well. Yeah, no, no, we are not seeing a lot of pushback. I mean, depending on the articles that you read in the space, there is some pushback. But on our side, it's an ever increasing area. In fact, we help clients do reporting prep work. So making sure that they're in a place where they can report. We are not a reporting group ourselves. And there's a lot of platforms out there that focus on this type of thing as well. I believe that the reporting requirements will increase. To what level? I mean, there's the decision is still out with the SEC here in the United States, but Europe is certainly moving forward in many ways. And so, depending on your organization where you operate, is really going to dictate the amount of reporting you're going to have to do. But I'm sure Adam has a lot more to comment here.
I think you did a really nice job addressing this, but I think that, the only thing I would add is there is so many organizations that care about their climate commitment, regardless about debate, that tends to be political, that they're moving forward either way in this space to decarbonize and make this happen. And the market has spoken. So I think to answer your question, it's a result of the fact that it has been successful. And, the numbers that I've read is that to hit net zero by 2050, the capital markets need to deploy globally $3.5 to $4 trillion a year onto decarbonization and decarbonization practices. And so the markets are already there. They're already deploying capital. They're already moving. They're already invested in this. Companies are already moving. They're already invested in this. And, whether or not somebody believes in ESG, the overwhelming demand from consumers for more sustainable services and products is carrying the day. The overwhelming demand from investors, where $1 out of every $3 invested in the capital markets in the U.S. today is in an ESG fund, is overwhelming and moving today. Where the regulatory environment is going with impending SEC regulations, and then you can go down to the state and local level, like you're seeing at California or you're seeing in New York City with Local Law 97, is overwhelming. And the tailwinds behind these are so strong that a debate over whether or not ESG is the right investment function is so tangential to the conversation that we're having here today about, companies who are moving forward to decarbonize.
Thanks. That's, hearing both of you say that, it's encouraging. We see a lot of pushback, particularly political pushback, which I do think reflects fear about success rather than fear that we're failing. The other big challenge that we hear from everybody that we interview is, we can get a pretty good handle on our scope 1 and 2 emissions, but scope 3 is almost a complete mystery to us. How are you two getting together a solution to understand scope 3 emissions, and what do we need to do to make significant changes to the visibility that a company can have about its up and downstream partners?
I'll start on this. I think as it relates to scope 3 emissions, the thing that's making it the hardest is the lack of information. So for those who aren't familiar, the way that a lot of scope 3 emissions are calculated is using a spend-based analysis. So if I spent X amount of money on airline tickets, there's a standard accepted practice that would create X amount of emissions, right? A very generic swag, if you will, at this. Whereas the tools exist, and there's companies, you can do a Google search today for airfare, and you can look at, based off of the aircraft type, the location where it's taking off and where it's landing, where we can build a more customized emission factor for that flight, and based off whether you bought a first class seat or a coach seat. And that's an example of something moving forward. There's a number of private sector companies, other private sector companies like Apple, who publishes their emission factors for iPhones and to what goes into making it. When you purchase, that purchased good becomes a scope 3 emission. And what we're seeing in the market as a whole is more and more companies in the manufacturing and services area starting to say they want to publish emissions factors for their products or services, and to create more data transparency in moving this forward. And that pressure is there's pressure being applied, I should say, from the people they're selling that to. It goes back to that consumer demand that is driving this as much as anything, whether it's a B2B environment or a B2C environment, that is driving this desire for data. The UK, as a perfect example, is starting to do the equivalent of nutrition labels, the carbon labels on certain retail products in grocery stores, right? So the data has been becoming more transparent and more available. And the speed at which this has accelerated over the last 24 months has been astonishing.
Do we need a public repository of that kind of information? Because your example of Apple's disclosing iPhone footprints is dead on. But I've worked with technology companies who, despite the fact they design a product to, say, for instance, earn a Energy Star rating, don't bother to characterize or do an LCA until maybe 6 months after the product launches. And it seems like we need a practice of populating scope 1 and 2 clearly and propagating it so that scope 3 can be easily extrapolated from using those products.
I agree. I just wanted to let's see if Scott wanted to jump in here. Absolutely. And I think that's where the market's going. And we're seeing that demand continue to increase for this more free sharing of data to help companies understand and mitigate their impact.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and add that, part of the problem is companies understanding what scope 3 emissions really look like for them.
Right.
And what they can access in terms of data and information. And so, for example, if you're using a contract manufacturer that does soccer balls in the morning and T-shirts in the afternoon, and it's going to be hard to gather your data from that supplier, right? And these networks are vast. These supply networks are vast, and it's not just supply; it's also corporate travel and other things, right? But first of all, educating the companies on the many sources of their scope 3 emissions, and then stepping them through data collection approaches and emissions quantification models, including economic input and output, life cycle assessments. You mentioned LCAs a minute ago, and supplier-specific direct emissions data gathering. These are hard things, right? And so understanding the various levels or levers available to lower those value chain, those scope 3 emissions, including product design and innovation, influencing supplier manufacturing processes, and industry collaboration and policy advocacy. These are all areas where an organization can have an effect, albeit not easy to do all the time, right? I just was speaking to somebody the other day who spent 3 years working with one company, and all they did for 3 years was travel from factory to factory. That's all they did, trying to figure out how to get these factories to change out a coal boiler and other things. So it's difficult. But discovering some best practices for engaging and collaborating with suppliers to establish these quick wins and then scale that progress across your supply chain, right? It's hugely important. And that's the kind of work that companies like Apple and others have been doing for years, right? To get to where they are, where they can make these commitments. And then help implement measures and track progress, like nZero, right? As a tool can help track progress and improve data collection over time. All these things will add to your ability to get your arms around your scope 3 emissions and make a difference.
So do you both see that the traditional confidentiality practices, companies will measure stuff but never tell anybody about it other than use it internally, are those practices giving way to collaborative approaches to understanding impact across the entire economy?
Well, we see it all the time. I've been at this for 20 plus years. I won't say more than 20, but it's been more than 20, but I won't tell you how many more. The statement you just made, I think 10 years ago was extremely common. Companies were doing all kinds of work internally, and very, very little of that information was making it out. CDP reporting, I think, was a huge lever to change all of that. And so the more companies that started reporting to CDP, the more data started getting shared, the more access to that data was available. And then other bodies as well GRESB and other reporting entities also having huge data sets. And that data has really helped create transparency in the industry and has created collaboration for best practices. And I think that we're going to see that even more so as people are more effectively managing that data going forward. And Adam, I'll hand it off to you if you want to add to that.
I just want to say the collaboration is probably the most exciting thing that's happening in the space, because even traditional business competitors are working together. An example of this is, in the data center industry, there's a group called Infrastructure Masons, and they have a climate accord. And even though these data centers may compete on deals, they're actually meeting bi-monthly to share best practices on sustainability, share how they're getting data, share how they're solving problems. And so it's a step beyond kind of sharing the LCA info and the emissions info they're collected, right? And it's to say they're sharing practices, they're sharing information, and saying, this isn't about a competitive advantage per se. It's about transforming an industry. It's about doing the right thing. And there's a number of other industries where you're seeing that collaboration to try and set standards, especially in those industries that have probably had the most scrutiny in the past because of their impact, working together to address and solve these problems and share data as well. So building very much on to what Scott's saying, where people are in that.
And on the implementation side, right? So you have, 3Degrees has worked with consortiums of different organizations from different industries to work on, really market-based problems, right? And some of that could be, availability of solutions in different markets. And we've also, you've seen aggregations taking place now, cross-industry aggregations for things like accessing renewable energy projects. And this has been going on for a little while, and I think we'll continue to see this. And I think you'll increasingly see this in the carbon space as well.
Well, I'll tell you, this is a very encouraging conversation. I just one last question, which is, what initiatives do you suggest that our listeners follow? Possibly because, those cross-industry pollination of ideas are probably the most valuable things that we haven't yet fully grasped. You can solve a problem in one industry and it finds a solution. It provides a solution for another, but nobody's talking about this thing. It sounds like they are now. What should people follow?
Well, this is Scott from 3Degrees. So, there's a lot of industry-specific initiatives that your listeners can check out. However, specific just to climate itself, I would just recommend reviewing science-based targets and the net zero standard. There's a lot of companies that have adopted these. There's a lot of work going on in that realm, which will be public, and it seeks for those who don't know what this is, science-based targets, net zero standard really seeks to align scientifically practices and targets with below 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. And so, additionally, there's RE100, right, which focuses on purchasing 100% renewable energy for companies' operations. There's a lot of collaboration that happens in the RE100 community. And there are many different initiatives and organizations that have formed to drive improvements in carbon reductions. And some of these are industry specific, some are not. And I would just recommend a good Google search is always highly helpful.
I would agree, and there's a group of resources out there to get up to speed, and there's a lot of great organizations who are coalescing at people from the United Nations and their work in climate, bringing together some of the largest organizations in the world, but also making sure to engage with smaller organizations from large countries to developing countries, and a lot of really good shared science and practice around that is another great resource that exists out there. But there's so many, great groups. And, and look at organizations. And I'm not saying this for the benefit of this call, but organizations like 3Degrees do a very nice job publishing data. And you can even follow like social media feeds and see information look at trusted organizations and the data and news that they're sharing themselves and see what's coming out from there. Because sometimes there's so much data, it's hard to figure out where to go and where, how to learn and get more about this. But if you can find trusted organizations, and again, I'm not promoting nZero so much with 3Degrees, look at stuff they have where there's that news cycle and data that they're sharing that is very
That's a plug to sign up for our newsletter, Adam. Thanks. Appreciate that.
Well, we'll include a link to that. But thank you both, Scott and Adam, for taking time to talk with us today.
Thanks for having us, Mitch. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Scott Martin, Vice President and Head of Global Commercial Business at 3Degrees, a carbon strategy consultancy that provides decarbonization program development, carbon sequestration, and renewable energy credit advisory services. We also spoke with Adam Kramer, CEO of nZero, a carbon tracking and reporting platform developer. And for more background on nZero, listen to our July 2022 conversation with co-founder and executive chairman Josh Weber. We'll also include links to learn more about the companies on the Earth911 article that accompanies this podcast. The rapid evolution of carbon tracking capabilities, which is going to continue for years as we get finer-grained insights into what we emit and how to reduce it, is a signal that indicates we might just avoid some of the worst impacts of global warming. We can do more than hope. We can work hard and make a difference. If your company hasn't begun to track CO2, ask why not. In a few years, the majority of your customers are going to be aware of their impact and want your help tracking and reducing emissions. All of the surveys, all of the information that we're seeing indicates that this is a trend and it's not going to reverse. I hope you take a few minutes to share this show and all the rest that we've done, more than 340 now, with your friends, family, neighbors, and coworkers. You all are the amplifier that spreads the ideas we collect here on Sustainability in Your Ear. So please let folks know they can find the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, and all the other fine purveyors of podcast goodness. I will deeply appreciate your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. We're going to be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet. Have a green day.